Good morning, everyone. It's 10:02, so I've seen a lot of people trickling in. Everyone's still welcome to join, but we're going to start with the webinar of today. A warm welcome to this webinar on the European regulation on forced labor and the impact of that regulation on the textile sector. This is the webinar, the fifth webinar of a series of 6 that we've been organizing to give you a bit of an idea of what's coming up with the European textile strategy and how that strategy will be impacting the textile sector. So this series is really designed to help you understand what is this upcoming legislations about, how will that transform the sector, and how might your company be impacted by that. If I say we, then I'm actually referring to 3 different organizations. This webinar of today is a co-organization of the Partnership of Sustainable Textiles, the Green Button, and GIZ Fabric. The Partnership for Sustainable Textiles is a multi-stakeholder initiative where different stakeholders like brands, civil society, standard organizations, and so on and so forth come together to really work towards a sustainable textile sector. Then you have the Green Button, that's a government-run certification label for sustainable textiles. And then you have GIZ Fabric, and this webinar is part of their Moving the Needle seminar series. GIZ Fabric is an organization that's promoting an environmentally friendly, social and competitive textile and clothing industry in Asia. They're hosting various amounts of technical seminars also for manufacturers, so interesting to also keep an eye on that. But today we're talking about the European regulation on forced labor and its impact on the textile sector. Welcome to everybody who's just joined. This session will help you understand what the legislation is about, what the potential impact of the legislation is on the regulation is on the sector, and what strategies might there be already to start preparing for impeding obligations within your supply chains. Very practically, this session is being recorded and all material of our experts will be shared afterwards. So no need to write everything down. The recording will be, shared. I have 2 colleagues in the background as well who will be monitoring the chat. I have Nazia Quintania, she's part of GIZ Fabric, and also Isabel Reichenbach. She's a project manager at the partnership. There they are. They will be helping and monitoring the chat. So in case you have questions, please feel free to use the chat box. There is a chat box item down below your screen. And should you have any questions for our experts, please feel free to share them. My colleagues will help sort them out. We have our experts in the background also monitoring that. They might be able to give you an answer straight away. All right, so the program for today is we have 3 different experts that will be helping painting the picture. But before we dig into that, I would like to ask a quick question from you. And that is, what are your expectations for today? If all goes well, there should be a poll showing up. Hani, my colleague in the background, will make sure to do that. And so our question to you is, what do you expect? Are you just listening in to learn more about the European regulation on forced labor? Or are you looking for specific answers to questions you already have? Or maybe you hope to take away a few tangible actions. I'm just going to have a quick look here at the poll. So people are finding their ways. It's beautiful to see. I see that most of you are here to get a bit of an understanding of what's going on and to get a good grip on a general overview. And then there's also quite a few people who hope to take home tangible actions. Well, I can assure you we will be working towards that. Thank you so much for indicating your expectations. And then it is an honor, actually, to introduce the first speaker to you. We have Anna Cavazzini with us today. Anna Cavazzini is a member of the European Parliament for the Greens, the EFA, since 2019. Since November 2020, she's also the chair of the Committee on the Internal Market and Consumer Protection. Before, she was part of the European Parliament also for the Federal Foreign Office and the UNO, and an advisor to various NGOs. She is well positioned to give us a good understanding of what the regulatory framework looks like and what the scope of the forced labor regulation is about. And she'll be also helping us shed a bit of a light on the role of the European Commission as an enforcer and investigator there. So Anna, please, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and hello to everyone from Strasbourg, where we are at the moment in our plenary session with the European Parliament. Great that there is so much interest on the forced labor regulation. So I will just give a brief overview on the goals of this regulation and also where we stand in the negotiations, because we are about to finish and to close the negotiation on this important file at the end of the term, probably also to the non-EU guests. We have European elections coming up soon, and our last plenary vote will be in April. So to me, this whole forced labor regulation was always the other side of the coin of the mandatory due diligence legislation. The first one is basically aiming at companies introducing due diligence checks and making sure that there's no human rights violations or mitigating the biggest risks of human rights violations in the supply chains. In brackets, this legislation is under huge threat at the moment, and it is not, I'm sure, at all if it will be coming. But if you have questions on that, of course, you are also free to ask me, but that's not the topic of today. The forced labor regulation is, as I said, the other side of the coin, a little bit of a sharper sword, because forced labor is obviously an even stronger human rights violation, introducing an obligation for basically public authorities to investigate if there's any suspicion that a product coming to the EU market or being already on the EU market containing forced labor. And if this investigation is deemed positive, so there is a proof of forced labor, the company, the economic operator, having the duty to withdraw the product from the market. So it is kind of a product legislation. This was also very much disputed at the beginning. So do we do like an import ban like the US, or do we design it as a product ban? And the Commission at the end came up with a product ban. And this is interesting from my personal point of view, because as it was said at the beginning, I'm chair of the Internal Market and Consumer Protection Committee. And of course, we have other product legislation that works very similarly. For example, when there is dangerous, whatever chemicals being found in baby food, then also the public authorities, market surveillance has the authority to basically withdraw the product from the market. And this will work a little bit similarly. There, for us as Greens in the European Parliament, and now it ended up to be the whole Parliament position, it was from the beginning very important to basically keep this product legislation, keep all companies in the scope. That was a little bit contested by the right side of the Parliament, but they could not basically succeed with this demand. Also to reinforce the remediation, to say, okay, if there is forced labor, the main goal is, of course, not only to not have those products in the market, but to make sure that the victims are basically properly being remediated. We also see it, for example, in some of the famous US cases, that when, for example, medical gloves were basically stopped at the border, then the company at the end paid the workers the fees that they were about, that the company did not pay them at the beginning, then the product at the end could be imported on the US market. And we in the parliament introduced basically a similar system in the regulation. A second point that is very much important for the parliament and the whole negotiations and the whole regulation, how we deal with state-imposed forced labor. Because first, it is of course very difficult for any authority to really go there and check. And also, secondly, we think it really adds extra bureaucracy to do all the checks, because we know already when there is forced labor that is state-imposed, the likelihood that the product contains forced labor is very, very high. So we in the parliament are really fighting for a reversal of burden of proof, that in that case, when a product comes from a region where there is state-imposed forced labor, that the company has to prove that it's not coming from forced labor. A third important point that is a little bit already in the parliament proposal, but much more in the council proposal, so that what the member states want is that the commission takes the role of a 28th authority, so not only the 27 authorities of the member states, checking and investigating, and at the end also deciding if there's a forced labor, but also the commission having a role in that. And also, submissions or complaints can be done with the commission, and then the commission can also basically investigate. The council, the member states, even go further and want that most of the cases land with the commission. I think I personally have the opinion that the commission shall play a role, but it should be a little bit more balanced, and not all cases should go to the commission at the end. Also, the member states have a role to play. So this is in short the content of the proposal. Of course, there's much more points, but this would go too far, I would say. And again, for me, the biggest goal of this regulation is really making sure that we eradicate forced labor in the supply chains, that we help the victims, that we make sure that there's also a good cooperation, that this whole regulation is being supported also by, development cooperation, by technical cooperation, to make sure that the countries concerned also can basically help the factories and the companies and so on. And I think it would be a very, very important regulation to also make sure that, for example, we have a lot of evidence that products that contain forced labor that are now being blocked in the US are being diverted to the EU, that we counter a little bit this deviation of flows of goods, and create a more global network where no country accepts at the end products made with forced labor. On the process, very quickly, we are now in the phase of negotiations between Parliament and Council. So both legislative institutions had already taken their position on the law, and now we have to find a common ground. And there is a lot of negotiations on technical level going on at the moment, and the last trilogue is on Monday, so next Monday in the evening, and most likely the whole night, because this is also one of the last days we really have to find an agreement because of our election calendar. And I mentioned already the contagious points or the differences between Council and Parliament in my introduction. But of course, let me know if you have also questions and remarks. I stop here and looking forward to the questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Anna, for a very comprehensive overview of what must be way more, but at least we had a good sneak peek already here. So what I've been hearing is that with respect to the content from the beginning, it was really clear that it needed to be a product legislation, and so really a product ban, all companies to be kept in scope, and that there's also a part focusing on reinforcing remediation if there is any forced labor being detected, that the main goal is also to make sure the victims are properly remediated. So I've been hearing also that how to deal with the state imposed forced labor. It's difficult for authorities to go there and really do the checks themselves. So there is, you mentioned the reversal of burden of proof. So companies have to prove if it's not coming, that it's not coming from forced labor in that case. And then the Commission also takes the role of the 28th authority here. So checking, investigating, and deciding whether there is forced labor in any case, in case there is a suspicion of forced labor. All right. Yeah, still in negotiations, but we can already dig in. So I've been hearing that the votes are being planned to take place end of April. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. So how do you see that role of the European Commission in investigating and enforcing compliance? Particularly if we're speaking in international supply chains where monitoring can be a bit more challenging. Can you give a little bit more of a view on that?
Yeah, as I mentioned in my introduction at the beginning, in the Commission's own proposals, the Commission basically had not so much of a role. And the Parliament changed this already in our position. We basically added the Commission as a 28th authority that is also investigating and also taking decisions, but also responsible for a database, because the regulation is also basically establishing a database with regional information. So that will also make it easier for the national authorities, but also for companies. And the council introduced a kind of a system where they say always when there is a union interest, then the Commission should lead the investigation and not the member states. And then is of course the big question: what is a union interest? Is it not always union interest?
Yeah.
And this is where I say I think we need a balanced approach. I, in principle, am in favor of, in all legislation, giving a little bit more implementation power also to the Commission, because also in a lot of different legislations we see that enforcement is really fragmented amongst member states, and often we also have the common weakest denominator. But I think also the member states giving all responsibility to the Commission is not a good idea either, because so far, for example, market surveillance authorities are really in the member states, and not using this experience would also not be wise, I think.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you for elaborating on that. So there is a question here about also the date that the legislation will be put in force. The question of the audience is: are you optimistic that the regulation will pass before the European election in June 24? And when would this legislation be expected to enter into force, truly?
Yes. I mean, I would say I'm optimistic because we have seen in the council vote on the mandate for the negotiations that there was only Germany abstaining because of the Liberal Party. That is actually causing a lot of problems at the moment in a lot of pieces of legislation. And Lithuania or Latvia, I think Lithuania, sorry. So only 2 member states against. So it is a different situation when you, for example, compare it with the due diligence legislations, where there's much more resistance or much more chaos in the council. So I think there is quite a big likelihood that this law will pass. But of course, we have to also see with how the trilogue on Monday goes. If we don't find an agreement on Monday, it will be, of course, very difficult just time-wise to pass it through. And there will be a lot of pressure on both legislators to give in. But I also know that the Parliament is not ready to just give in on on anything. So I'm quite optimistic, but it's not a given. We have to really see, and the current chaos in a lot of files makes also sure or shows us that at the moment I think the council is really chaotic and really very divided. So this concerns me a lot. And on the implementation, let me double check, because there's always different months.
Yeah.
And I don't know them by heart, or like a different So the Commission has proposed 18 months. The Parliament wants 12 months. The Council wants, again, much more implementation time. This is usually the case. So the implementation time until when it's really into force is also part of the negotiation still.
Right. Okay. So I hear stay tuned, right? And is there anywhere people you could refer people to stay up to date on these decisions? Is there a source for people to follow?
Yes, I mean, of course, all the respective MEPs who are negotiating will definitely communicate about it, but also the two committees of the European Parliament issue regular information, and for example, especially after the trilogue, also on the content. So the Internal Market Committee and the Trade Committee issue press releases and also on their Twitter accounts or X accounts inform about the negotiations.
Okay, perfect. So should you want more information on that, make sure to follow those sources, dear audience. There is another question from the audience, a little bit off topic, but it ties into what we've been talking about just now and making decisions and having to vote on certain aspects. And the person from the audience says, well, due to the important date today regarding the vote on the CSDDD, do you have updated insights on the status of that vote? And what is your feeling of the outcome, if we may ask?
I think it is difficult, and I'm, to be honest, very, very frustrated how the whole file is going down at the moment. And especially, I'm German, how the German government had started all this mess. And also how much wrong information is floating around in the public, and how much also business lobbies are kind of also pushing against the law. I mean, I know there's so many companies also pushing for the law, but the big business associations in Europe had been really strongly advocating against the law. And also from an internal market perspective, I always say it's better to have like one unified rule in Europe than a huge fragmentation of the internal market. So I think there might be today no majority. Let's see if Belgium keeps it on the agenda or postpones it to Friday. This is, I think, still unclear.
Okay, also to be kept an eye on. But thank you to give us a bit of an understanding there. All right, there is another question from the audience. We, by the way, have until 10:30 because then Anna will have to leave us. So should you have other questions, please feel free to share them with us via the chat. There is another question from the audience stating that when the new law on forced labor comes, would it be the same consequences like for VW at the moment in the US? And there is what could be a consequence for textile products?
I think also this is still to be determined, because what the Parliament wants is that we have, as I explained, like a little bit like a faster and easier process for state-imposed labor. But still, of course, the authority would need to decide or establish that there is forced labor.
Right.
And then it depends a little bit how fast and when the authority would establish that. If the cars are still on the ship and have not entered the European Union yet, and then comes the decision, then we could, in theory, end up a little bit like in the US with VW.
Yeah.
But I think more likely, because we don't have this import ban, because we have this product legislation, and I think another more likely situation could be, the VWs are already on the market, but then the Commission or whatever, the Finnish authority says there's forced labor in it, there are products from Xinjiang in it, and then VW would need to withdraw the cars. But of course, anyhow, the whole idea would be to have also more of a preventive, like the preventive character of the law is very important, to be like, okay, probably VW will think very carefully if they want to have this risk, because their products might not be allowed anymore on the EU market.
Right.
And I think for the same for the textile sector. I think, big textile companies would I think, need to think very much again about their supply chains and make sure that their workers are being paid correctly, because otherwise they risk of their jeans or whatever being withdrawn from the market.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, thank you very much for that. We have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to have a look at another question very quickly. So maybe on the the checking upon the regulation. So if the Forced Labor Act will come in force, will it be the customs who will check, or BAFA, or another institution to establish that no forced labor is in the product? Who is going to do that?
All the member states would need to designate an authority. And for example, in countries like Germany, where we have already an authority checking the German due diligence law, I think it could make sense to have the same authority to also designate to work on forced labor. But of course, it's not a given, and every member state would need to decide this. I can imagine that member states designate the customs, who knows, or designate probably the market surveillance authorities. But this is then up for the member states to decide.
Okay, all right. Maybe one more very small question, and that is, in your opinion, what would you advise companies, brands, suppliers to do already? Like, is there an action that they could take at this stage, knowing that there's still negotiations going on and so forth, but maybe there is something they can already focus on?
I think really companies could, as a preventive measure, already check. I mean, technically, they should always do this if there's risks of forced labor in their supply chains, and then have a strategy on how to mitigate this and to deal with this. I think this would be the smartest thing to do already quite early, because then you're prepared if the legislation enters into force, and then you don't have to change anything anymore.
Right. So start having a look at that risk assessment and bring everything already in view. All right. Thank you so much for your input, for having been with us today, even though it's very busy there. I can hear. Anna, you are very much thanked for your input.
Thanks so much for the invitation, and sorry that I have to leave. I wish you a great discussion. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. All right. And thank you all for your questions as well. It's very much appreciated. So we're talking still about European regulation on forced labor ban, and we have a second expert for you to dig a little bit further in that topic. Not from the legislation view this time, but from a company perspective. We have Libby Anat. She's a partner at Due Diligence Design. And so Due Diligence Design helps companies and businesses prepare for existing and emerging responsible business conduct legislations and international due diligence standards. So she's helping companies prepare for that. Over 20 years experience she has with working on responsible business conduct issues, and she also supports businesses to really design and implement effective responses to human rights, labor and environmental risks. And that's exactly what we heard Anna say, that you should start be looking at your risk assessment there. So what a beautiful and smooth transition to Libby. Libby, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Magali. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. It was really fantastic to hear from Anna in terms of what's actually going on with the regulation negotiations at the moment. Some really, really good insights and information there. What I'm going to do today is take you through what companies need to know. So we'll kind of just circle back and look at what's in the regulation at the moment and what companies need to do. So what are the most critical steps in developing a strategic approach to minimize the risk of an investigation and preparation for what you could do when an investigation is triggered. It's good to just remember that our analysis of the law as it stands at the moment is based on the draft regulation from the Commission, and we'll pull in some of the key negotiation points that the EU Council and Parliament have put forward in their positions for trilogue. So just to kind of underline that we don't have the final text of the regulation yet. We'll have to wait for the outcome of the trilogue this week. But it sounds from what Anna said that things are moving ahead very positively. So I will just share my screen with you. Hanny, is that working okay? I think it is.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Great, fantastic, thank you. So let's just have a quick recap or snapshot of the regulation, and then we'll walk through each of these points in more detail. So the regulation on prohibiting products made with forced labour on the EU market was published in September 2022. It bans products made with forced labour from entering and being distributed on the EU market and from being exported from the EU market, which is a significant difference to the current US law of full power, which I know many companies on this webinar are probably already familiar with. The scope is really broad. It covers all companies and products, regardless of size. So there's no exemptions in the way that there is within the EU CSDD or lowering of requirements if you're an SME, for example. So all companies, all sectors, and all products are covered. And you'll see as well that it covers a full value chain. So it really is everything that's in your value chain as a company. As Anna said, the trilogue negotiations are in progress at the moment. The Parliament adopted its negotiation position in October of last year. Council put forward its negotiation position in January. As Anna said, we've got that final trilogue negotiation this week, and then we should hear what the final text of the regulation is. So if everything goes according to plan and the regulation passes the vote successfully, that means by 2025, if you're looking at large companies, you're probably implementing the German Supply Chain Act. Hopefully, fingers crossed, the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. You'll also be implementing the CSRD, the Reporting Directive. So by 2025, 2026, if you're a large company, you've got a lot of reporting and regulation on your plate. So given that you've got this 2 to 3 year window now, we would absolutely concur with Anna that this is the time to start thinking and preparing for that regulation coming in, particularly given that this regulation covers a full scope of your value chain. So of course, when you're looking at how you manage and mitigate the risk of forced labour in the lower tiers, and particularly kind of commodities such as cotton, for example, that's going to take a lot more work in preparing for that. So one of the things that we do at Due Diligence Design is help companies understand what they need to know about the regulation, but also what they need to do. So we're just going to look now at what companies need to know and dig a bit further into that. So as we said, it bans products made with forced labour from entering, being distributed, and from being exported from the UK market. And that's the key difference between the US ban on products, is that within the US, those products that are banned can be re-exported from the US. And one of the concerns expressed within the EU market was that the EU could end up becoming a dumping ground for those goods from the US, hence trying to pull these two pieces of legislation into some kind of alignment together. It covers all companies placing goods on the EU market, but from what we understand in the regulation, there'll be an emphasis on larger companies at early stages of the EU value chain. So that's an important point to note. This is to ensure that enforcement by the regulators is focused more on where the risks are most prevalent and the impact is the largest. So it's taking a risk-based approach, which is what companies do in terms of where are the risks most severe, where can I have the most impact. But it does mean that if you're a larger company in the textile sector, so if you're a larger company per se, you're more likely to be investigated by the authorities. In terms of the trilogue position, the EU Council has also proposed that the regulation covers online sellers. So that would be products offered for sale online or through other means of distance sales. There's probably a few companies that are in target for that, such as a big online retailer such as Temu and Shein, where their offer is targeted at consumers in the US. So we're getting a little bit more equality on the marketplace there. It covers all products and components. So I know there's been a few questions about the components in the VW cars, regardless of sector, origin, stage of the supply chain where forced labour took place. So just to reinforce it, it's covering everything. The regulation uses the ILO definition of forced labour, including the ILO's 11 indicators for forced labour. Clemence, who is following me in this presentation, is also going to talk a little bit more in detail about those 11 indicators, but I think most companies are familiar with them and applying them within their monitoring of the supply chain. I think it's just worth remembering that in some cases and situations, those indicators can be subjective and are very compound in nature. And that means there's potential for interpretation by competent authorities in how they look at certain situations of forced labour. Companies should not rely on the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive and/or the German Supply Chain Act for compliance with the forced labour ban. So you should not see this regulation as an extension of the directive. The directive recognises that impacts may still occur in company supply chains, where this regulation is looking to ensure that products are fully clean when it comes to forced labour. So even if you align with the CSDD, fingers crossed that it comes in, and the German Supply Chain Act, that will not be enough to ensure that you're safe from investigation and from being found in breach of the regulation. Okay, let's look at the role of the authorities who are enforcing this law. So enforcement is by EU member state competent authorities and customs authorities. Given where the file originates from within the EU Commission, it's likely that that competent authority will be from your Ministry of Trade or equivalent ministry or department within your government, within the EU member governments. Competent authorities will determine what products and companies are investigated. We'll look a little bit more in depth at the investigations in a few slides on, but the investigations must be risk-based. So the competent authorities are required by the Commission to focus their investigations on where the risks are the highest, most severe, and have the most impact. As Anna mentioned as well, the EU Parliament in its negotiation position has also introduced this concept of burden of proof, which is a little bit like the environmental precautionary principle. So that means that you can assume that some products are made with forced labour if they're produced in high-risk areas. So that could be products originating from certain geographic areas, production sites or economic activities in certain sectors where there's systematic, widespread forced labour practices, and where you would assume that those are manufactured or provided using forced labour. So in those cases, the burden of proof would be on the companies to demonstrate that those products are manufactured or provided without using forced labour, and that's on the companies to provide that evidence. So, I mean, that's a significant shift from where the Commission initially proposed. Customs authorities, so we have this dual enforcement. So custom authorities within the EU are then responsible for stopping products that the competent authorities have determined are made with forced labour. They have the mandate, or they will have the mandate under the regulation to identify and seize products and require them to be removed from the EU market and disposed of. And we'll look at what that disposal could entail. So in terms of the basis of the regulation and how that all gets laid out, so the Commission will introduce additional pieces of legislation called delegated acts. These will require companies to submit traceability to information to the customs authorities on any high-risk products or geographies. So that's a significant shift from what you're required to do at the moment. And the Commission has indicated that the traceability information it will require will extend past Tier 2 level to raw material production. We would expect, as you would expect as well, that those delegated acts would focus on products from conflict-affected and high-risk areas and from countries with state-sponsored forced labour where the risks are, again, the most severe and highest. As Anna mentioned, the EU Commission will develop a database, and that database will be used to identify high-risk products and regions and any risk indicators. So the database is intended to help the competent authorities set strategy on what to investigate and when and how to review cases. But I would say it's not necessary for a product to be listed in the database or be subject to a delegated act to be investigated. The second point is we feel it's very unlikely that a product would be flagged as high risk or severe or banned by US authorities and is not also within that database or included as a delegated act. So I think we could expect some coordination between the EU and the US on these matters. And potentially the UK as well, which has banned certain products such as PPE made with forced labour from entering the UK market. And then in terms of the who can submit an investigation, so any individual and any organisation can submit a case, but it's the competent authorities who decide what is investigated. When a case is triggered, companies have only 15 working days to prepare a submission to the competent authority, and those submission requirements are really substantial. The Commission has indicated to us that dialogue is really, really important. So they've emphasised the importance of that. The intention, particularly at the preliminary investigation stage, so the intention is that companies are able to explain their approach and how they're managing risks. But that is not clear under the regulation. It may not be interpreted in this way by the competent authorities. A decision against a company by the competent authority could result in litigation. If the CSDDD goes through where you have the potential for litigation, it's highly likely that if a case has been found against a company in terms of forced labour, that there wouldn't then be a case brought against a company, particularly for remediation of impacts. We have also prepared some information on the investigatory process, but I think, I'm just looking at Hanny and Isabella now, that I'm probably out of time. So I want to whiz through those, although we can come back to them in the QA and just have a quick look at what we advise companies need to do so that we can keep to our time frame. So many companies that we work with in preparing for this type of legislation have been also taking similar steps to manage forced labour in relation to the UFLPA regulation in the USA. What we are advising companies to do is that these are basic steps around the due diligence framework within the OECD and the basis of the CSDDD as well. So develop a forced labour policy and strategy that meets key guidance. And by key guidance, we would advise that you look at the EU forced labour guidance for high risk products and geographies, the OECD due diligence guidance, which has, for our sector, has a specific chapter on forced labour, and of course the EU CSDDD. So any investigating competent authority will look to the EU forced labour guidance first and OECD guidance as well when looking at cases. Map which products and sourcing regions are highest risk across your full supply chain. So do that now. The EU CSDDD also includes risk mapping. I think Anna mentioned it as well, but that's really what you need to be doing to get off the blocks on this. Ensure you have full traceability for all high-risk products so that you're ready to respond to investigations. So anything where there's regions where there's persistent issues with any ILO forced labour indicators, any campaigns on forced labour, anything that's been indicated in the US Department of Labour reports or has already been subject to a US withhold and release order. Those are areas you're going to want to ensure you've got traceability on and you understand what's happening in terms of forced labour in those situations. For each high-risk product and geography, put in place programming to prevent forced labour if you can. So you will need to demonstrate to the authorities that you're carrying out programming to prevent forced labour. If you cannot, be prepared to exit that supply chain. If you're unable to prevent, mitigate or address any of the harms, then you should be prepared to exit that supply chain. And as I said before, be prepared for any potential civil litigation cases against your company to follow on if decisions are made against you. I'm going to end there. I'm just slightly over time, so apologies to our hosts and moderator. We had quite a lot to get through and look forward to some more technical questions following this.
Thank you so much, Libby, and no worries at all regarding the time. I think this is super valuable information for our audience, so thank you for sharing.
There's a lot to get through for companies, yeah.
Yeah, but no worries there. So yeah, for your information, dear audience, the presentations will also be shared and the recording will also be shared. So you will have this information to go back to still. A few highlights that I picked upon from your presentation, Libby, that is that, yeah, there's no exemptions here. All companies, all sectors, all products are targeted, actually the whole value chain. There is an emphasis on larger companies at these early stages. So authorities will be applying a risk-based approach, and large companies there are more likely to be investigated. That's what I have been hearing as well. So we are not to rely on the CSDDD or the German Supply Chain Act for compliance only. Yeah. It's not an extension of that direction. And so that risk-based approach is something that we heard Anna say already, and you now as well, for companies to start looking into where are the regions that the risks are most high, and also start preparing for labor policy and a strategy that meets key guidance. And that's important to know that that's the OECD due diligence guidance and the European CSDDD as well. So that's tangible things for our audience to hold on to already. So thank you very much, Libby, for your input. We're going to transition to Clémence, and after that we'll be having a discussion and questions between the
Magali, could I just make one small technical point? So in terms of what companies need to rely on, the EU published some guidance a few years back, which we can put a link to in the chat, which is EU forced labour guidance, which preceded the file from the Commission. It's guidance, it's not binding, of course, but I think companies should refer to that in the first instance. And it does refer to state-sponsored forced labour. So we'll put that in the chat. Our advice would be get your legal counsel to make sure that they're familiar with that guidance.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that addition. Super valuable. So refer to the chat to get that link, dear audience. All right, then we can transition to our third expert, which is Clémence Aron. She is part of the Mekong Club, and she will be giving a reflection on the forced labor ban and recommendations also for companies. So the Mekong Club is developing practical tools and solutions for members to address modern slavery in their networks and their supply chains. And they're also managing cross-functional projects involving a diverse range of stakeholders. Well, that's actually what Clémence is doing, working with different stakeholders such as private companies, NGOs, the Chamber of Commerce, governments, and so on and so forth. So Clémence will give us a little bit of an insight on the vulnerabilities within the textile industry supply chains, and also strategies and tools for companies to help identify, address, and mitigate risk. So Clémence, go ahead.
Hello, and thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for organizing, and thanks to Hannah and Libby for your very insightful presentation. My name is Clemence Aaron. I'm with the Mekong Club. As you said, we are a membership-based organization. We're based in Hong Kong and we work with companies all over the world to address modern slavery in their operations and supply chains. I'm going to share my screen. And today I will discuss forced labor vulnerabilities in textile supply chains and also share some recommendations. I don't know if it works. Share some recommendations for companies to identify issues of forced labor and conduct due diligence. Oops. Just to begin with, I would like to share a few numbers. So today there are 50 million people in situation of modern slavery in the world. There are more slaves than any time in history. And out of this 50 million, there are 22 million people in situation of forced marriage and 28 million people in situation of forced labor. I will provide a definition of forced labor later on, based on the ILO definition. And so there is 86% of victims of forced labor that are working in the private sector and in global supply chains. So that means that the food that we eat, the clothes that we wear, and the electronic devices that we use might be associated with modern slavery and forced labor. So if we look at some numbers shared by the Global Slavery Index that is showing estimates on forced labor, they are measuring the connection between modern slavery and global imports by the G20 countries. And so electronics, garment and textiles are the top products that are being imported that might be associated with forced labor. In total, there is 468 billion US dollars worth of goods that are imported that are at risk of being tainted by modern slavery, and 35% of those products are textile and garments. So this is a sector that is highly vulnerable, and sadly, forced labor can occur at any stage of the production process in textile supply chains. So I would like to share a definition of forced labor. According to the International Labour Organization, forced labor means all work or service which is exacted from a person under the threat of penalty and for which they haven't offered themselves voluntarily. So we have the notion of penalty and involuntariness. And as Libby said, this definition is used by the EU, and it's the main definition that will be used in policies and used to identify cases of forced labor. Migrant workers are highly vulnerable. They are 3 times more vulnerable than other adult workers to forced labor, according to the IOM, the International Organization for Migration. And so I'm going to share an example of a migrant worker that ends up in a situation of forced labor. So this is a migrant worker who is accepting a job in a garment factory in a nearby country. And as part of the recruitment process, she's hired by a labor broker, and she has to pay $1,500 US to be hired. That includes various costs. But there is no transparency, but she wants to get the job, so she accepts. And after the signing the contract, there are additional fees. It raises the cost to $3,000 US, which is a huge amount of money for her. And because of that, when she starts working for 2 years, she will work to pay back the money that she owed. And she's told that she cannot leave the factory until the debt is covered. And she cannot leave because the factory is keeping her passport, which holds her in place. So that's an example of a situation of debt bondage. Debt bondage happens when workers have debts either that happen during employment or that is inherited, and it is binding them to employment because they have to work without getting any pay because all the money that they get is going to repay the debt. So that's one example, one form of forced labor, and migrant workers are extremely vulnerable to this. Migrant workers are going from one place to another, not necessarily a country. They can be internal migrants and also international migrants. And they are, as I said, more vulnerable. So you mentioned it, Libby, as well. There are some indicators that were created by the International Labour Organization and that can be used by companies, their suppliers, auditors, anyone looking to understand and to analyze the situation to see if it's forced labor or not. Those indicators, they are more like a guidance. And I'm going to name, there are 11 of them. The first one is abuse of vulnerability. In general, it happens to workers that don't speak the language in a country and they cannot, for instance, understand their contract, or they accept conditions that they would not accept in a normal situation. Deception, it's a situation where workers were promised something in the contract, and then when they start employment, conditions are very different. Excessive overtime is another indicator of forced labor, when employees are working way beyond the legal limits and they have no choice. They might have no choice because they are forced or because they are not getting paid and they're expecting to receive a salary. Isolation is another indicator of forced labor, when workers are cut from the outside world and they have no contact. So there is no way for them to communicate and talk about the working conditions. Another indicator that you probably have heard of is the retention of identity documents. It's when an employer or a recruitment agency is keeping the documents to hold the worker in place. Withholding of wages can also be used to keep workers in place when they think that they are not getting paid, but they will stay at the factory, at the facility, because they expect to be paid at some point. Restriction of movement when workers are not able to leave the site is also an indicator of forced labor. Abusive working and living conditions is when workers are working in a dirty, unsafe place, and that they would never have accepted those conditions in a normal situation. So that could indicate that work is not freely chosen. That bondage, what I just mentioned, when workers are bound to the employment because of that, is also a strong indicator of forced labor. And finally, physical and sexual violence that can occur as well to force workers to work, and intimidation and threats, where if workers are willing to leave the workplace, they can be threatened, and that would prevent them from leaving the workplace and continue working. So those are indicators. As Libby said, it's important they can be used to analyze the situation, but in some cases, it's important to ask to the competent authority. We have a document on our website that the Mekong Club team created that is breaking down the indicators. It's introducing indicators, showing examples and sub-indicators, and it's relevant to factories. It's been translated into 7 languages, and it can be used by companies and their suppliers. So if you're interested, I encourage you to check our website and share these documents in your company and among your suppliers. So I would like to discuss a few reasons why there's still forced labor today and what are the drivers. First, the lack of transparency. Supply chains are very complex. Companies are having suppliers. I mean, there are different tiers in the supply chain, and suppliers are in multiple countries, which makes it difficult to put controls in place and to monitor labor conditions. A lot of companies are also outsourcing and subcontracting in order to meet buyers' demands. Factories sometimes have to subcontract even when it's not authorized, and they might work with companies that are operating in the informal sector or that are where it's impossible to monitor labor conditions. So that's increasing the risk of forced labor. Lack of regulatory oversight in some region. There are poor laws and regulations to address forced labor, which makes it easy for unscrupulous actors to take advantage of vulnerable workers. Another reason why there's still forced labor is social audits that are showing some limitations. Social audits is really important in terms of compliance, but when it comes to identifying forced labor or child labor cases, it's sometimes failing to identify them because it's just a snapshot of a situation at a given time, and it doesn't give the full picture. So it has to be complemented with other channels to collect data from suppliers and workers to better understand situations. Irresponsible recruitment is also a driver of forced labor. As I mentioned earlier, there are suppliers working with agencies that are not ethical and that are charging workers excessive recruitment fees and benefiting from it. Price pressure is also a driver of exploitation and forced labor. Brands tend to produce at the lowest cost possible and are squeezing suppliers, which lead them to have tight margin, and in the end, it's impacting workers. There are conventions on forced labor. There are the ILO indicators, but there is no standard because it's often case by case, and you need to analyze and understand the situation. But the lack of guidance makes it difficult sometimes for organizations and individuals to understand forced labor. And finally, another thing that led to more cases of forced labor is COVID-19 and crises that have disrupted supply chains, and some businesses are now had no choice but focus on survival rather than thinking of being ethical or sustainability imperatives. So we just discussed the drivers. Now, what I would like to talk about is what can be done by companies. So Libby shared recommendations for companies to address forced labor, and it's aligned with the framework of human rights due diligence. So I'm not going to introduce the framework of human rights due diligence, but I would like to emphasize some of the steps and talk about what can be added or what requires attention when companies are implementing due diligence. So in the commitment phase, when creating policies and a management system, and Libby shared that as well, it's important to make sure that forced labor is mentioned in policies, that is defined, and that all forms are being defined, and that relevant indicators are used. Something crucial to addressing forced labor is within an organization to train employees with responsibilities so that they understand what forced labor means, what are the indicators, and what can be done at their level. When assessing risks in the supply chains, important as well to map the entire supply chain. The regulation, the proposed regulation requires to trace products. So it starts with mapping, and also because forced labor risks in general do not occur at the tier 1 level, but in lower tiers of the supply chain. So it's important to get started, build visibility, and eventually being able to trace high-risk products. Reviewing high-level risk and forced labor risk more specifically is also essential. And there will be a database shared by the EU that will share information on high-level risk commodities and countries. And it's important to review those risks and look at supplier, where they're based, and the type of products to have a list of products that requires more attention. And finally, two last steps that I would like to emphasize. What is also essential is to adopt preventive measures. It's better, prevention is better than cure. So we recommend training suppliers and to equip them with the necessary knowledge so that they can identify signs of forced labor in their own facilities, but also in their supply chains. Because what's required is also to cascade requirements to make sure that lower tiers in the supply chains are also taking measures to address forced labor. And finally, what is also required in the proposed regulation is to take action to remediate issues and engage with suppliers and workers in remediation. So those are, to me, some areas that require attention when willing to address forced labor. I would like to also talk about responsible recruitment and its importance. And I think I saw a question related to this. A lot of cases of forced labor are linked to irresponsible recruitment practices, as workers are paying excessive recruitment fees to agencies. So what is recommended is to commit to the employer pays principles, which states that no worker should pay for a job and that the cost of recruitment should be borne by the employer. So there are different costs, recruitment fees, and other related costs that workers have to pay. But in general, having those fees to pay lead them to end up in a situation of debt bondage and so in forced labor. So it is recommended to have a program to ensure that responsible recruitment is promoted in supply chains. And so to prohibit charging recruitment fees, to prohibit the retention of identity documents, to make sure that the contracts that workers will have are clear and easy to understand in a language that they understand. And finally, and that's really to go beyond those requirements, to work with suppliers so that they select ethical recruitment agencies. It requires a lot of collaboration and communication between brands, their suppliers, agencies, as it's a huge issue, recruitment fees and workers bound to employment. And also, I was talking about remediation, and this is something that Anna mentioned. When there is, for instance, an issue of workers having paid fees, that is identified, work together with the supplier on remediation to make sure that those fees will be repaid, as it's part of the commitment to the employer pays principle, avoiding workers to pay fees. But if they have paid fees, it's important to make sure that they will get their money back. And my last comment, last recommendation is to, when conducting due diligence and implementing measures to comply with the regulation, it's important to engage with key stakeholders. And key stakeholders, I mean suppliers and workers. To screen your suppliers, you can send self-assessment questionnaires just to see if they have, it's a first screening to see if they have policies and procedures in place to address forced labor. Social audit is also a way to evaluate their performance, but it has to be complemented by other methods such as worker surveys. The only way to understand a situation in a factory is to get feedback from workers, because they are the key stakeholder that is concerned. So surveying workers is recommended in high-risk suppliers. Establishing a grievance mechanism, it is different from worker survey. It's a system through which workers can report violations and concerns, and having a system in place to receive their complaints and provide remediation accordingly when there is a need. And finally, another way to engage with suppliers and workers when there is a case of forced labor or cases of forced labor identified is investigation in collaboration with a third party to understand the situation and make sure that you can take appropriate action in terms of remediation. And yeah, and I would say that there will be more and more requirements for companies to conduct due diligence and to address forced labor in their operations and supply chains. So it's time to get started. And it's important to know your supply chain first. It's the first step to be able then to take appropriate action and address risks. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Clemence, for your insightful information as well. There was a lot to digest there as well. Luckily, we will be receiving your presentation and a recording afterwards. But what I've been picking up upon is that the textile sector is highly vulnerable for forced labor, actually. And we've seen the numbers that's quite confronting, actually. And so migrant workers are more vulnerable there. There is various amounts of indicators that companies can start looking at to get a grip on what do we mean by forced labor. You've mentioned transparency. That's a huge issue there as well. Not only transparency in a company, but also throughout the entire supply chains. You've been talking about various amounts of drivers that are keeping forced labor still existing. That transparency is one of them. And a lack of regulatory oversight and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of aspects that come with this topic, actually. So thank you for giving us an insight on that. We're going to transition to the Q&A. Before we do that, I want to ask you, the audience, to have a look at the feedback form that my colleague will also be putting into the chat right now. Your feedback is most warmly welcomed. It takes only a few seconds and it helps us improve our services even better. So go ahead and have a look at that chat, and I'll be transitioning now towards the Q&A, because there's a lot of questions that came in via the chat as well. And I want to start with having a look here at the questions. Actually, a question that that ties into what Clémence just was talking about having the need of transparency in the supply chain, making sure that you have all relevant information. There's a question from the audience here that states that what would happen if we don't have the information of the deeper supply chain because our direct supplier won't reveal any information? And that's actually a question to both Clémence and Libby. So what happens? What is a company to do if there is, if they bump into a lack of transparency because a supplier refuses to collaborate?
Shall I go first, Clémence? Okay, I think it is. I don't think it's as huge as a risk in the textile sector as it is in some other sectors, such as electronics and auto, where there's a disparity between the end company and the supplier in between is sometimes bigger, so has more commercial, financial leverage. In my experience, most suppliers will provide information on their supply chain. If they're refusing to supply that information, then I think it's a question for the company in terms of, does the supplier have the capacity to trace? Do they need some support in doing that? If they are refusing, then I think it would be a question for companies on whether they want to continue with that supplier or not, because it's certainly putting them in a very difficult legal position, which could create a risk of breach of the regulation or potential civil litigation. So thinking with a kind of a lawyer and legal counsel hat on, that's what I would advise in that case. And we see companies making similar decisions quite frequently around that these days.
Yeah. Okay. So actually take responsibility and act upon it.
Yeah, I don't think there's any quick routes. There's no routes to circumnavigate that. There's no kind of giant silver bullet of information that exists out there that you could tap into.
Yeah. Would you agree, Clémence?
Yeah, there's no right or wrong answer. What I would say is that it's important to show suppliers your willingness to collaborate and work together, because sometimes if you're being too strict and not willing to understand the problem, they might hide information. So to avoid that, what I would recommend is to show your willingness to collaborate, to do maybe a root cause analysis to understand why there is non-compliance, and if it happens for one type of non-compliance, that could also happen for other things that are more serious. So encouraging transparency, incentivizing transparency, rather than being the best, the most compliant supplier, to me is important.
Yeah, right. And showing there actually that both parties are willing to also look at problems and challenges then.
Yes, and also because there is now there are more and more companies being transparent and saying, yes, we do have identified cases of forced labor in our supply chains. And actually companies saying that they don't have any cases, it seems impossible. There are 28 million people in situation of forced labor. There is forced labor in many sectors. So if we could shift towards an industry that is working together to identify and address the cases, that would be ideal.
Okay, thank you for that. Libby, there's a question more on that regulation specifically, and it states, could you please clarify how offshore companies of the EU will affect the new laws? For example, German company textile goods sourcing from Bangladesh.
Does it make any difference? Your full value chain is covered. And it's a question regarding a subsidiary, because I believe that your subsidiary companies would be covered as well. If you're bringing anything into the EU market or producing anything on the EU market in your value chain, whether it's own operations or value chain or your subsidiaries and you're a parent company, it would still be covered. I hope that's all right. I can't see the question in the chat, Magali. Oh, I can see it now.
Yeah, okay.
From Kimberly Islam. Okay. Yes. Yeah, so I think that answers that. It would be in the value chain, whether it's owned operations or subsidiary or supplier sourced.
Right. So any stakeholder actually to be taken into account and also be taken into account in that risk assessment that needs to be done. All right. A question to both. Is there any simplified grievance channel established for the downstream supplier to address the forced labor issue?
There's a requirement within the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that companies establish grievance mechanisms twofold, one for stakeholders within the value chain, such as workers and worker representatives and trade unions, and then another broader one where anybody, such as members of the public and your consumers, could raise issues. So if that part of if that legislation goes through, that would be a grievance mechanism that companies would be required to implement. There are also specific country or national-based grievance mechanisms, such as the Accord or Amada Kota in Bangladesh. But I'm not aware at the moment that there's one single grievance mechanism that's specifically designed for forced labour. Clemence, anything? No.
Are you muted, Clemence?
Sorry, I was on mute. I would say there's no simple way. It's not simple. Grievance mechanisms are not simple, and it takes time to implement a system that will be effective. So I don't have any simple way in mind. But maybe trying to collaborate in some countries, like in Bangladesh, with existing mechanisms, and in other countries with organizations working on the ground, being used to addressing those cases, having worked with victims in the past and experience. That's what I would recommend. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. We have another question here on migrant fees. Clemence, you have referred to that in your presentation, that's an indicator actually also, and the salary and the debt bonding that is involved with forced labor. And the question is, well, there is a problem with migrant fees in certain countries, which are then, or we could consider like an indicator for forced labor. However, those fees might not be considered illegal in those countries. And the question is, that gives brands a hard time when trying to fight the fees. And could you suggest how brands should behave in that case, or what should they do? And that's actually also a question to both.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's quite complex. You have, in different countries, you have different laws. In some countries, fees are prohibited, but then the definition of fees can differ from one country to another. So I think what's important is to understand the context in each country, understand the local law, and then like having your own company policy. In general, like if you commit to the employer pays principle, workers should not pay for a job, which means that they shouldn't be paying fees. And in your calculation, you need to refer to, like, each country has different contexts, like, and they can pay the fees before leaving their home countries or when they arrive. It's very complex. So again, it's important to work with local organizations to understand the situation. laws are changing and evolving. So yeah, yes, in some countries it's not forbidden, but if you want to be responsible employers, you should promote those principles in your supply chains and work with your suppliers, work with agencies, so that to prevent workers from paying excessive fees and ending up in situation of disadvantage.
Right. Anything to add to that, Libby?
No, I think well, what I would add is that obviously if your risk assessment has identified this as a specific risk in your supply chain, then you would be expected under this regulation and under the CSDDD to implement a strategic action plan for dealing with such a complex risk. And within that, you should absolutely be consulting with stakeholders. So that would mean workers and representatives on the ground, but you could also consult with bodies such as the IOM, which is part of the UN. There are other organisations as well which have a lot of experience in doing this. So I think I'm kind of agreeing with Clémence and what's saying. You take this on a case-by-case basis. Don't do a one-size-fits-all. Consult with your stakeholders, come up with a plan for prevention and remediation. And I think there was a point I missed earlier as well, which Anna had touched on, that the EU Parliament has introduced this concept of remediation in their negotiating position, whereby products made with forced labour are banned from the EU market until the company demonstrates it has stopped using forced labour in its production or supply chain, and that workers are remediated for any harms in their operations and supply chains. So if you don't have a complex action plan in place and you don't have evidence to demonstrate that workers have been refunded or remediated for these costs, then that's going to be an issue.
Yeah. All right.
And to add to that, you can find online, you can find guidance from the ILO, the IOM. That's the first thing to understand, but then it has to be applied to the local context. So I recommend getting in touch with local agencies on the ground.
Yeah. Okay. So both being a responsible employer and a responsible party, but also work on that risk-based approach, or applying that as the regulation is really looking at that as well. I'm looking at the time.
Magali, can I just make another point as well, that when we're talking about the value chain, there are risks of forced labour within the own operations side of a value chain within the EU, such as in warehouse operations, logistics. So it's important that companies also consider that, because you could find the same issues actually occurring within the EU, not just in countries outside of the EU as well.
Right. Thank you. Maybe two more questions here. Time is running out, and as always, the difficult factor in such interesting webinars. So, Clémence, a question to you still. How is excessive overtime determined? Is that more than 60 hours a week, or how do we have to look at that?
So overtime is also a very difficult issue to address. According to the ILO standard, workers shouldn't work more than 60 hours. But if you look at the reality, workers are working more than 60 hours in a lot of factories. So what I would recommend is to engage with suppliers, to encourage them to be transparent. And if it's more than 60 hours, then ask them to talk about the reason why. Because in general, if they are working more than 60 hours, it's because they have to meet that deadlines, and it's a capacity problem. So I would recommend encouraging transparency, and then working together with the supplier to see if there's anything that can be changed so that they can meet the buyer's demands. Something that can be done as well is to engage with, if it's a supplier that is shared by other brands, it's to work together with the other buyers to have more leverage and encourage them to make progress. But I would really say to encourage transparency and share the real data to then understand how together you can remediate this.
Right. Okay. So again, taking that responsibility and acting upon, All right. There's maybe one more question here. If I look at the time, maybe time for two. We'll see. Can, and if so, how can the draft regulation better address the shortfall between minimum wage requirements and living wages. So is regulation or the draft regulation capable of addressing the shortfall between minimum wage requirements and living wages? I see you think, Libby. Is a question clear, or is it?
No. I'm just thinking about it. I think the CS triple D addresses that more specifically. But of course, if you have wages that are below minimum wage and you have other indicators of forced labour as per the ILO indicators, then you would definitely be in a situation of forced labour. I'm not sure if it's going to give you what you're looking for, if that question's from Grace. I think it's more likely that the CS triple D is going to better support companies in implementing that. I don't know what you think, Clemence.
Yeah, agreed.
No. Okay. All right.
Although I just to come back to what Clemence was saying before around like excessive overtime, that piece around making sure your purchasing practices are in place and that you've got a purchasing practice policy and you're monitoring those types of issues, that would go some way in contributing towards wages if you're doing proper cost model. Cost model. What's the word I'm looking for? Costing models that incorporate a full wage in terms of living wage costs and full costs of labour higher in a factory. Yeah, that would be one recommendation.
All right.
Yeah, worker they will never. I mean, of course, they will ask for more work, but it's just because they're not getting paid enough to survive. So it shouldn't be used as an excuse by a factory. And last thing, I mentioned it was important to collaborate, but at some point, if the supplier is refusing to comply and to make changes, then buyers might consider like ending the relationship, but in a way that is responsible. And what's important is responsible exits, to make sure that when ending a relationship with the suppliers, understanding what will be the impact and trying to make sure that workers will be paid.
Right. Yeah. And also they're taking your responsibility then, actually. All right. Thank you so much, Libby and Clemence. We're at the end of this session, unfortunately, because I have the feeling we could go on talk forever. But thank you so much for having been with us today and for sharing all your valuable input that will also be shared with the audience afterwards. In the chat, there is a link towards a feedback form. If you're still with us, please have a look and provide us with your feedback. That helps us improve our services and serve you even better. So your feedback is warmly welcomed. Thank you, Clemence, Anna. She's not with us anymore. Well, she's still alive, right? But she's not here anymore. And then Libby for having been with us. Voila. I have the honor to still give Isabelle the floor to introduce the next session for you. So Isabelle, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks also from my side to the experts and to you, Magali, for moderating today's session. And I'm happy to invite all of you to join our final session of this webinar series, which is called Tackling Greenwashing, the Directive to Empower Consumers for the Green Transition and the Green Claims Directive. And I hope to see many of you there. It's taking place next week on the 6th of March. Yes, thanks a lot.
All right, good. Hope to see you all there. That's another yet interesting session that we're preparing for you. So thank you for having been with us, and I wish you a beautiful day still.